reminder that we love questions from the audience. So you can start commenting your questions now, or you can also add them as we go. I'll be right back on to welcome our guests to the show. Thanks for meeting us for coffee. Watco Logistics makes supply chains simple. Whether it's rail, road, river, ocean, or intermodal, they manage your supply chain with efficiency and care. From heavy haul trucking to e-commerce fulfillment, they tailor solutions that fit your business, no matter the size or the complexity. Watco combines smart technology with real human insight to keep your cargo moving and your operations running smoothly. You can learn more about their full suite of services at watco.com/logistics. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This is episode 61 of the Meet Me for Coffee podcast. I'm your host, Samantha Jones, and always looking forward to another great conversation with my guest today. Before we get to bring on my guest, though, just a quick reminder that Manifest is coming up in we're like right at the 2-month mark, just about. It will be in Las Vegas again, Manifest the Future of Logistics. And I really encourage you guys, if you have never tried it, to give it a try. If you have, start thinking about strategy, because if you've attended, you know how large this conference can be and how overwhelming it can feel when you get there. So to help you guys plan, I'm going to have Pam Simon from the Manifest conference on the show soon. We'll do a special edition episode and we'll talk about really how to kind of strategically plan your experience at Manifest to make sure that you're connecting with the right type of people that makes sense for your business, attending the right types of sessions, and getting the most out of it. If you guys are interested in attending, you can save $200 off your registration if you register through my link. I'll put that in the comments after the show, but also you can find it on my LinkedIn page, or you can just shoot me a message on LinkedIn and I'll send you the link directly to register to save a couple $100 there. Okay, that's kind of, conference season is wrapped up. We're already thinking like next year. So that's one of the first ones in the new year. If you guys are attending other conferences in Q1, I'd love to hear what they're going to be. I know there's a couple other ones out there, but would like to hear where everyone's planning to head once we kick off 2026. So I know what else is out there. I will not be traveling for any of these conferences. I will not be attending Manifest this year, as I am expecting a baby at the end of January, but I'm going to have a lot of FOMO and I want to hear from you all and see all your pictures and let me know how everything goes. Without any further ado this morning, I'd like to bring on my guest, Mr. Keith Prather. Keith and I had the opportunity to, I had the opportunity to hear him speak in September in Chicago at the JOC Inland Conference. You were part of the economic market outlook forum there. And I said, hey, I don't know that guy yet. I feel like I need to get introduced and talk to him. So thanks so much for agreeing to come meet me for coffee so I could get to know you.
Absolutely, and thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this for a long time, and we learned something. We learned that we don't live that far apart. I didn't even know that. So
Absolutely. In hindsight, we were like, we could have done this like in person somehow because he's just a town over from me here in Kansas. And so it's great to have you on this morning. And I know that you and I got to connect a little bit so I could learn more about who you are and what you do. But for everyone who doesn't know you yet, would you please mind saying a little bit more about yourself, who you are, what you do, and your business as well?
hey, absolutely. So I'm the managing director for Armada Corporate Intelligence. We're kind of the oxymoron company, right? That's a little joke line there. I Back in the day, I was a CFO, and I started my career as a CFO. Got advanced degrees in mathematics and finance, business, a lot of economic studies. So I thought I was going to go the CFO route, but my father came out of the intelligence community, so he worked in DC. We did a couple of tours in DC as a family, and so I grew up with this little bent toward intelligence and understanding it. And I thought around 1999, I thought, corporations, executives really need that kind of intelligence. And so we started Armada in 2001. And for the last, 25 years almost, we've been providing what we call corporate intelligence to executives around the world. And corporate intelligence is really just really understanding the operating environment for corporations. So understanding everything from domestic and international economics to supply chain activities, what's happening up and down their whole value chain. And so we started the company based on that. We started out by doing very specific private intelligence briefings for executives behind the scenes. No one knew we were there. Do these daily briefings that would hit executive desks, helping them understand their operating environment. And then over the years, we branched out, and we are now doing a lot of public economic forecasting. We built a lot of economic models and modeling, and that's what you saw in Chicago was me kind of rolling out and unveiling some of those models and some of those forecasts. And so again, we have a very select client base. We're very small, but we do work with a lot of large supply chain logistics organizations, and just absolutely love it. I love supply chain logistics. And again, 25 years, I've got a little experience, but probably not enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it just, as I heard you talking through your charts and giving your presentation in Chicago, I was like, that's exactly the type of stuff that we try to, discuss on the podcast. So I have to get this guy to come on the podcast. Really looking forward to hearing your insights today and letting you share those with all of us. So let's jump into it. Actually, I think for anyone who missed Chicago, you kind of had an opportunity to stage set for 2026. But maybe, that was a couple months ago. Maybe you've kind of honed in a little bit more. Some things have even changed. So let's kind of set the stage with that today. And I'd like to hear from you on like high level. What are you thinking as you guys are advising people moving into 2026, and what should we be preparing for or expecting for the new year?
Yeah, and that's great. And I just talked to a trucking executive yesterday, kind of reconfirmed a little bit of what I was thinking. So in Chicago, when you heard me, I was probably a little more optimistic. I was thinking by the end of the year, inventories were fairly balanced. We weren't seeing an overbuilding of inventories, and we thought that with just a little bit of demand that we'd see the economy take off, especially the freight economy. And since then, we've probably pulled our expectations back a little bit, to be perfectly honest and right up front with everyone. Demand for next year, if I was going to draw it in a wave, it would look like conditions are going to be fairly flat through the end of the year. Obviously, we've got just a few weeks left. In Q1, still remaining a little bit sluggish, but then in Q2, every one of our forecasts is showing a surge. And that surge is lifting into obviously Q3, but it's also ending the year pretty strong. So everything, whether we're looking at retail, whether we're looking at housing even, we're looking at non-residential construction, looking at all those factors that drive freight and logistics demand, we're getting a lift sometime mid-year. And I know we're going to talk about a lot of the reasons why we get that lift, but there's several key triggers that I think we're watching. And there's some headwinds in there, to be honest, Samantha. There's a few things that could send it the other direction. But
Yeah.
we're starting to see, I think, in our forecast, that lift in the second quarter, and a lot will be based on what happens with demand.
Hmm. Okay, well, yeah, definitely want to talk through the demand triggers as well as the potential headwinds. But first, I wanted to ask you because I heard you use this term, and a lot of people have probably heard the term K-shaped recovery, or we're in this K-shaped economy. Can you explain to some of us what that means if we don't fully understand what people are referring to when they say that?
Absolutely. So in the economy, we think about household incomes and we think about how we divide households in the United States up. And typically, we think about them real simplistically as, upper income, middle income, and lower income households. And there are thresholds in there. So we'll say, $100,000 and up is typically a higher income household. 75 or around 50,000 to 100,000 is going to be middle income, and then below that would be a lower income households. And what's happened is, typically in most economic cycles, and we think about a cycle as, recession to recovery. And in those cycles, what we would do is we would normally see most households, most corporations all recover at the same rate. But once in a while, we get a very rare recovery. And instead of a V-shaped recovery, it's a K-shaped recovery. And this is one of those times. The last time we went through one of these, Samantha, was in 1979, 1980, 1981, and they're typically inflation driven. So coming to the pandemic, we had heavy inflation as we were spending and we were consuming, and we had global supply chain problems and pressures, and so it made product prices surge. And when that happened, we started to lose what we call the bottom end of the K. So households making less than $75,000 a year were not seeing their wages grow faster than inflation. So every month they fell further and further behind. The upper end of the K, though, is where all of our growth has been for the last 4 years. That's what's been driving the freight volumes that we have had. It's been driving retail spending. It's been driving automotive. It's been driving everything you can think of across the economy. And so that's why we could scratch our heads. We talk to auto dealers and they'll say, hey, the Ferraris and the BMWs are flying off the shelf, but I can't sell some of my entry level vehicles right now. And it's been scratching their head as to why that is. And it's because of that K-shaped recovery. And what we're watching for in 2026, one of those demand drivers is sort of a race and a push that the administration is in right now. Can you activate the bottom end of the K? And
Mm-hmm.
the only way you can do that is to tame inflation or increase wages on the bottom end of the K, while you help the upper end of the K stay optimistic and continue to spend. And what we have seen over the last couple of weeks is a little bit of a reversal of that. We've seen the upper end of the K get nervous. So those upper income households are starting to get really nervous and starting to get conservative in the way they spend. And so we see them doing things like what we call down branding. So instead of shopping at Nordstrom's or some of the higher end department stores, you're starting to see them migrate down brand into, the Kohl's and the Macy's and, maybe even down into the Walmart brands. And that's not trying to demean any of those brands. It's just
Sure.
simply saying that the upper end of the K is becoming even more value driven and more price conscious. And that's creating a headwind for the economy overall. But we'll see what happens. Early in 2026, we're going to get the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which is its actual name. But the tax bill, households will start feeling the benefits of that starting in January. When they get their paychecks, they'll see those cuts. And we're thinking that maybe that helps spur a little bit of the bottom end of the K and maybe give the upper end of the K a little more optimism, and then spending takes off. That's the hopium part of the outlook for
That's the hope.
2026,
Because,
right?
and I know that. So now we're talking about a K-shaped, recovery. And starting maybe almost 2 years ago already, we started talking a lot about something called the soft landing for the economy, where if we would be able to tame inflation without, hurting the labor market, we could stick this soft landing and avoid a recession. Well, at least so far, we've avoided what would be officially considered a recession. Now we're talking about trying to improve the lower half of that K on the recovery side. But, you mentioned that they need to see inflation kind of stay under control, which we've been seeing some positive signs of lately, I believe. And then the labor market is kind of a question mark as well. But we were also, if we go back a couple years, we were trying to control the labor market and start to pull down and see some slower growth in that space intentionally. So I think this leads us back to what are these factors that are going to either impact our demand side or become a headwind for the demand side? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on what comes to mind first.
Sure. So on the demand side, I think it's kind of interesting because buried down in the tax bill is a lot of provisions for what we call 100% bonus depreciation. So companies can write off the price of an industrial project early on, but there's some interesting caveats put around that. So the administration wrote into that bill demand that those projects have to be completed and occupied by the end of 2030. And a typical construction project runs 3 to 5 years. So in order for those projects to really materialize and to happen, these data centers and new manufacturing centers and power generation, all those construction projects have to have shovels and dirt sometime in 2026 and 2027 to be able to hit those deadlines and take advantage of that benefit. And so that's one demand driver that we have seen a little bit of over the last 2 to 3 years, but it really hasn't kicked in any large degree. So that'll hit. The other thing that's happening is the Federal Reserve and moving interest rates. And I don't want to get ahead of us here in the discussion because that's a big topic all by itself, but we're watching two different things on the interest rate front. We're watching what the Federal Reserve does, and then we're watching what the US bond market does behind it. The US bond market really sets the tone for long-term interest rates. And so when we're watching the 10-year Treasury, typically when the Federal Reserve moves and lowers interest rates, you see the 10-year come down with it. But the one thing that bond markets are very allergic to are deficits and inflation. And so that brings us full circle back to what happens with inflation and what happens with the deficit. With inflation, as you said, you're right on, that we see inflation fairly tame right now. So we watch a very unique number, and I know you and I off camera kind of talked about this a little bit, but there's a thing called, let's just refer to it as average inflation. Average inflation right now is running about 2.7%. And the Fed's target rate is 2%, but they're happy with a 2.5, 2.6, as long as it's heading in the right direction. And we're still waiting on that tariff-based inflation to hit, and that's what they're afraid of. But right now, we're not seeing it in the macro data. And so from that perspective, it gives the Fed the ability to move. So the other demand driver then would be the Federal Reserve trimming rates this month and next month, the 10-year following it down a little bit. And with those two interest rates coming down, it stimulates the housing market. And last little thing I'd add here on the demand side is that the housing market then creates, for every single new home we build, creates about 7 full truckloads of demand. And so right now, if we're building, 500 to 1 million homes less, over the last several years, and that creates a tremendous amount of demand that's been, just sitting on the sidelines. And so activating that and that part of the market, the housing market, should be another stimulative growth driver. And then the last little thing on demand I'll say is, again, is going back to the upper end of the K, we've got a sentiment problem right now. The upper end of the K is concerned about the economy. They're concerned about the impact of AI on jobs, and they're concerned about that side of what's happening with the overall economy. And I think they're a little concerned that any administration, doesn't matter which one's in office, would have the ability to head that off. It's a little more of what we call a systemic risk, because AI is something that's new and it's designed to replace people, and it's hard for you to just create economic growth to offset that. It's possible, but it's more difficult to do than something that's just simply part of an economic wave. And so anyway, if we can get the upper end of the K more optimistic about the future, and if they're not as afraid of AI as they should be embracing it probably, then the upper end continues to spend. We activate the bottom end of the K. We see the housing market generate, and we see the non-residential market kick off. That's the prescription for growth. And those would be the growth drivers that push us forward and kind of push us out of this 3-year transportation recession that we've been in.
So it sounds like to me in all of those scenarios that you laid out that a lot of it is dependent on inflation at least feeling like it is still steady and in control, somewhat in control. And we've been waiting to see if we were going to get these inflationary impacts from tariffs. And thus far, like you mentioned, we've seen very little. How do you think we should be feeling and the Fed should be feeling about, like, are we in the clear yet? And what percentage of a risk of inflation is tied to tariffs? Is it 100% at this point? Like, the only reason we're discussing inflation is because of tariff-driven impacts, or were there other headwinds that could push on inflation?
Yeah, I think there's two things, and we haven't really talked much about the product versus the services side of the economy yet. But one of the problems with inflation right now is wage-driven inflation in the services sector. So, we think about nurses, we think about doctors, we think about
Yeah.
engineers, we think about that demand, and we're seeing wage inflation over there that seems to overwhelm everything else. And that's a very challenging problem to fix on the inflation front. I mean, it'll naturally come down, but it's going to take a longer period of time for us to get it down. There's not many triggers or levers that we can pull overall to be able to pull it down. We've got to create labor, got to create the capacity that we need there to bring wages and flatten them out. On the tariff side of the equation, then we've been dealing with an interesting set of scenarios there as well. For one thing, what we didn't necessarily really expect was like let's just take the Chinese tariff, for instance, at 47%. We didn't expect a lot of Chinese manufacturers to instantly discount their prices on their products, 30, 40, 50% to help offset the impact of the tariff. And so you take that, and then you take lower maritime rates, you take lower inbound domestic drayage rates, you take the entire supply chain, and total landed cost for a company bringing a product into the U.S. was actually a little bit lower after the tariffs were imposed than it was prior, because
Hmm.
they were able to go negotiate all these discounts up and down the supply chain. But there's limited ability to take advantage of that, and we're running to the end of that time frame. What's happening is that foreign manufacturers are now getting to the point where they've trimmed their margins so much that they have no choice but to go ahead and pass on some of those increases. They're going to have to stop taking those deep discounts and pass that on. And we're starting to see in some of the November survey data that we saw, that you're seeing input prices for a lot of manufacturers starting to go up all of a sudden, and they're going up sharply. And so we think that tariff impact, that inflation impact is still coming. We think it's just rolling out and spreading out over a calendar year, and that we'll start to feel those impacts. Now, that being said, I just want to remind everyone that tariffs are really what we think of as a one-time market adjustment. So a company will take that price increase, we get hit with that one-time inflation adjustment, but then after that, we stick at those higher prices. But after that, the increases in inflation are going to be very modest, right? It instantly gets back to that 2% Fed rate that we're expecting. And even in the Fed's forecast, they were forecasting 3% inflation by the end of this year, but then by mid-year next year, they see it dropping right back
Right.
sharply, yeah, to 2.4, 2.5, and then by the end of next year at its 2% rate. So again, what the difference is, I think, from the forecast versus reality, is that we're seeing that tariff impact spread out more than we had expected it to be spread out. But there's still going to be some of those inflation pressures coming, and that's what's got the Fed tied up in knots. They just don't know how big that impact will be.
Right. Okay. And so now, we know that the Fed obviously monitors two fronts, inflation and the labor market. We just kind of we've talked a little bit already about the labor market. Could you expand any more on thoughts around the recent data that we're getting from we kind of flew blind for a couple months during a government shutdown, and then we got some labor data, and now we're trying to figure out like how, I think, alarmed should we be, or is everything okay? Did we show resilience when it comes to the labor market? Are consumers going to be okay? Do you have any additional thoughts on what we've seen from the recent labor data?
Yeah. I mean, I think you brought up a critical point, because we're still lacking the federal level data. So we've got private ADP data that's showing weakness, especially in small businesses. You see small corporations
Yeah.
kind of trimming headcounts. We see large corporations kind of hanging on to their headcount, but those are the ones making headlines. You see the Amazon announcement, they're going to eventually lay off over 3 or 4 years, maybe upwards of 600,000, or 60,000, I'm sorry. And you see these big cuts. We saw more than 150,000 layoff announcements over the last 90 days. And again, that's kind of what has the upper end of the case spooked a little bit. For the first time, we have a technology that's kind of hitting and aiming at those white collar, 6-figure jobs, jobs that historically we would have never thought would have been under pressure, and now they are. And that's kind of affecting the spending and the sentiment in the upper end of that K. But with the private data that we see in the labor markets, that's what has everyone a little bit nervous, because we do see weakness showing up. ADP reported contraction of almost 30,000 jobs in the last monthly report from November. And we believe that carried over a little bit into December. And again, a lot of it are layoffs in the business and professional services area, a lot of those white collar jobs. So that's where the concern is. Now, they're blaming AI for it, but to be honest, it feels like we probably overhired during the pandemic, and this is an opportunity for a lot of companies to go in and do what we call some right sizing, right? And do that right sizing now under the guise of, hey, it's technology, it's automation. But at the same time, there's some very real replacement of different types of jobs and positions being done with technology, and it's a very real factor. So that, you're right, that coupled with maybe some inflation that's not coming in the way the Fed thought it would, is making them lean a little more toward fear of labor weakness. And as we all know, I mean, by the time we get labor data, it's a lagging indicator.
Right.
Typically, by the time you see the pressure, it's too late to do something about it. And so they need to get ahead of it. And that's why we think tomorrow, at the time of we're recording this, we're going to probably get that Fed 25 basis point cut, and then maybe even another one in Q1, depending on what the federal labor data comes in looking like.
And so on the upper part of this K, we have this labor data. You mentioned how we're a little bit more concerned around the threat to AI or general. I mean, I think a lot of people got pretty comfortable with a couple years of a very favorable job market. We saw lots of job switching, lots of promotions, lots of wage increases, and now we're kind of, I mean, there could be young professionals who moved up a couple notches in their organizations during that time. And so now for the first time, they're having to experience a potential fear of, am I replaceable, or what could happen? So I think part of the sentiment we've seen are fears like that as well, where we're seeing sentiment kind of low across the board. But also I that affordability has become a big part of sentiment. And I wanted to get your thoughts on affordability as well. There's, whether we want to call them jokes or what we call them, but we saw like announcements around like a 50-year mortgage and a 15-year car loan. And if it is a joke, it's kind of a dark joke, because the reality is we're getting to a point where it's difficult for people to afford a home on a 30-year loan, which is not good for sentiment, right? So how are we handling, or in what ways do you think this kind of shakeup we're going through right now in our economy could potentially be framed up to help with affordability?
Yeah, so affordability really has become sort of the new buzzword, right? It doesn't matter what party lines you run down, everyone's talking about it, and it's very real. And again, it goes back to the K-shaped recovery, as you said. It's affordability really in the lower end of that K, and trying to make sure that that happens. And when I talked about the K, I didn't mention that when we think about the lower end of the K, it stretches up into the middle class or the middle income households. You're still talking about $75,000 a year, which captures big portion of the economy. So it does reach up into higher incomes. But the affordability issue, again, there are two different ways to attack it. One is increasing supply. And so that would mean that we've got to do things to free up like the spec home building market to be able to go build on spec, thousands of additional homes to try and bring the price of entry-level homes down. The other thing then would be to increase wages, and we know that there's a cap on that. We can't go very high on that. So on the affordability side, like you said, some of the levers that are being pulled and are being attempted or being talked about are, the 50-year mortgages, and like you said, being able to get a 15-year loan on an automobile. They're real, so they are in the works. There is machinery behind the scenes working on making that happen, but there are risks, obviously, right? With the 50-year mortgage, it really is like an interest-only loan, and it would work for some folks, right? There's someone who's getting into an entry-level home that's not going to see a tremendous amount of price appreciation on that home. It might make sense for them to do that to get a lower monthly payment and get into a new home, start building at least a little bit of equity in that home, and then move on or refinance in the coming years. So from that perspective, it makes sense. Also, for someone who's transitioning maybe, and they know they're only going to be in a home for 6 to 8, maybe 12 months, that makes sense to get into something like maybe a 50-year mortgage, and that makes it a little more affordable. in those cases, people may even step up a little bit into a much more expensive home using the 50-year mortgage to spread the payment out, knowing they're only going to be there a short period of time. And so you could see some people taking that as an option to maybe go, game the system a little bit and buy an expensive home in an expensive market that know is going to appreciate really fast and then jump out of that home. But a lot of risk involved with that as well, as you know. And so they're very real. They're levers. Whether they have a big impact on the overall housing market or not, probably not. It's going to be a sliver of the population that really tries to take advantage of that. In automobiles, when you're talking about going beyond even 7 years, which we see was sort of stretching it, you are starting to get up into a level where people get upside down on those vehicles. So I've got a car that's worth a lot less than what I still owe on it, and I think there's greater risk on the automotive side of things, extending those payment windows too long than maybe on the housing side of things.
So you mentioned supply as a way we can kind of combat affordability. And so have you seen signs that the government or, our broader economy is focused on trying to control some of the inflationary pressures or availability pressures even on our supply side to kind of help American purchasers and manufacturers start to feel less strain and less pressure on their supply chains, which would hopefully be a positive pass through for the end buyers as well?
Yeah. So for some, just thinking about the administration, trying to be apolitical here, right? As best I can. But thinking about what the administration's done, there are some signs where they're absolutely trying to increase supply. So you think about the whole notion of drill, baby, drill. That's really all that's aimed at, is trying to get supply up to pull prices down. Okay. Releasing regulation to try and free up manufacturing to be able to produce more with less cost, allow them to produce faster. That's aimed at that. But the tariff situation kind of flies in the face of it. So, long term, maybe it does help increase supply, but in the short term, it kind of chokes it off a little bit. We've got a lot of people who are, not certain about where to go with their tariff strategies. How do I combat rising tariffs or tariff uncertainty? Do I reshore? Do I nearshore? Do I friendshore? Do I use, the China workaround? How do I do that? What's my strategy? And the tariff situation in trying to help is really kind of working the opposite. And it's actually tightening supply and pushing prices up for many commodities. So, in general, I think we see some hints of it moving in the right direction, but we're getting these countervailing headwinds that kind of come in across it. And it is creating some confusion, at least from an economic perspective, and trying to forecast, how inflation will ultimately come down. There's just too many crosswinds kind of being thrown our way at the moment. So yeah, I wish I had.
We've been anxious to shed the uncertainty that's kind of weighing on the markets, but we're not quite there, are we? We're not quite out of the woods yet.
No, we've still got 4 of the biggest trading partner deals that have to get negotiated. So you've still got China, India, and really Canada and Mexico still hanging out there. And I think with Canada and Mexico, we're going to build uncertainty as we get closer to the USMCA negotiations and that deadline in October of 2026. Based on just how the relationships are going between the U.S. administration and those two governments, just doesn't feel like we're making the kind of progress we should be. Now, anyone who's been around negotiations for years, right? Especially you think about union negotiations. There's the storming, norming, and forming process, or storming, forming, and norming. And right now we're at the storming phase, where everything that's publicly being said is all about storming and creating the leverage and negotiations that we want. What's happening behind the scenes, though, may be a lot more amicable than what we're hearing publicly, right? It may be going much better than we think, and then we're going to wake up one morning and all of a sudden the deal's in place. And that seems to be the cadence with this administration. So we'll see. But right now, I do think there is still a lot of uncertainty out there for a lot of managers trying to make decisions, especially long-term decisions based on what they're being given as, this volatility back and forth.
Yeah. And it does seem like we are kind of entering a new stage of the some of these tariffs, at least, where at first all the announcements were super broad based and we're just like, we're going after whole countries and lots of them at one time and no exceptions. And I've heard we're starting to work through exemptions on a more commodity kind of based level. And what is the strategic purpose of that? Are we trying to alleviate some of this pressure on consumer inflation, on supply strains? I mean, it seems like we've decided there's some things that we can't go from paying 29 cents a pound on bananas to 60 and be happy about it. So what are these exemptions targeting?
Yeah, you nailed it. I think we're in that new wave of exemptions. And so in 2018 and 2019, to go back to the first Trump term, there were 55,000 tariff exclusions filed with the USTR, and they granted about 14,000 exclusions at the time. And so we've all been waiting on this phase to come, right? We knew it was coming. We just wanted to see it. And last week, the president did exactly as you said, bananas, cocoa, coffee. He said there's a lot of consumer pressure there. There's a lot of visibility to those. Let's go ahead and waive the tariffs on them. Without even going through a formal USTR process. It's just swipe and pen, they're waived. And so I think we're in that phase now where I know as I work behind the scenes with a lot of associations, we're filing a lot of briefings right now with the USTR to simply say, look, we can build domestic capacity for a specific item, but it still looks like we're 3 to 5 years off of even having realistic domestic capacity. You've got to phase in that tariff impact or you're going to kill inflation, you're going to kill these companies. And so we're looking for that exclusion or that waiver temporarily, and then maybe it even ratchets up over 3 to 5 years to still encourage reshoring. Sure. But we're going to start seeing a lot more of that, especially in areas where we are starting to see shortages. Anything that's going to have a shortage relationship with it, I think is an area where we're going to see those exclusions get granted. But there's a process we go through. In 2018, 2019, they awarded them in 3 big phases. So you'll see a wave of 100 to 1,000 that get granted, and then you get another one, then you get another one, and maybe if history repeats itself, we'll go through a similar cycle.
Here's the question out of left field, because I just thought about it as we've been talking about consumer spending and we've been talking about tariffs. There was I don't know if we could chalk it up to more than just a statement made around tariffs potentially becoming a tax credit back directly to American families and consumers. Do you see any real probability that could happen in 2026?
So a couple things tied to this. One of the things that has kept the bond market kind of headed down into a yield range that we like. Let me explain that for 1 second. So the 10-year bond market is critical in activating the housing market and getting costs down for corporations to free up corporate spending. And we've seen promises of anywhere from $5 to $10 trillion being invested in the U.S. And part of that is contingent upon companies being able to borrow at lower rates. So right now, the 10-year Treasury is sitting at about 4.14% yield, right? And then we add 1.7 to 2 points on top of that, and that's how you get your mortgage rate. It has been inching toward 4%. 4% is a psychological threshold that's critical. Once we hit 4%, it starts to free up money. Once it gets down to about 3.5%, money really flies off the sidelines. Projects start. You see construction activity take off, and off we go. The one thing the bond market hates, again, is deficits. And anything that the administration does that looks like it makes the deficit worse over time, and this goes for not just the administration, but Congress in general, the bond market, the yield rate goes higher. In 2024, when the Federal Reserve dropped 100 basis points off of the Fed funds effective rate, we saw the 10-year Treasury go the wrong way, right? So Fed funds rate coming down, Treasury rate went up. Normally they come together. And so what we're hoping happens is that we see some real deficit relief, and I'm going to come full circle. So we see deficit relief, which helps pull the bond market down. That stimulates economic activity, grows tax revenues, and helps with that deficit wheel and getting it spent down. If we do the rebates, okay, if we give consumers that little gift, the bond market sees that as a inflation, or basically a deficit building activity.
Right.
They're hedging right now. The reason why it's come down is they're hedging right now that all of those tariffs that they're collecting is going to be used for deficit reduction. And so if they
Yeah.
start giving it back and spending it, or if the Supreme Court rules against the administration, it shows the deficit going the wrong direction, yield rates will surge and go right back up with it. So the
Sure.
administration has to be very careful and figure out, do they really want to activate grassroots things like you and I talked about, affordability of housing, right? What would really help consumers is a sub 6% interest rate. But the only way to get that is that 10-year treasury can come down below 4% and keep going down. The only way that happens is if bond hawks see the deficit coming down proportionate to the way the economy's going. And so
So would it be accurate to say at this point, like it or not, tariffs were a form of tax? They did create income for the federal government and for the United States government. And now even like the IEPA case that's in the Supreme Court could be a potential for a major headwind against that. Because if we get a ruling that we have to go reverse a lot of these tariffs and we're essentially giving taxes back to the people who paid them, that would also be a strong headwind against that bond, the treasury yield coming down as well.
absolutely, yeah. And no one wants to talk about it because we don't even know how to model what the financial impact would be if you have to go figure out how to give back, $500 billion.
Yeah.
How do you do that? What's the legal process? What's the legal precedent? How do you prove that they paid the tariff? And who does it go to? Blah 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 blah. But yeah, the tariff as a tax, someone has to pay the tariff, right? And there's always been this thing, it's a tax on the consumer. Well, it's only a tax on the consumer if it does get passed on to the consumer eventually. Right now, it's a tax on supply chain logistics professionals and foreign manufacturers, right? They're paying the tax, but it does get paid. And yeah, anything that disrupts that, like the Supreme Court ruling or anything else in the mix that would make us pull that tariff income away, would set the bond market off and send the bond market in a different direction. And remember, the IEPA tariffs that the Supreme Court's ruling on would only affect those countries that still have reciprocal tariffs in place. So if we have a trade agreement with like South Korea, for instance, that new trade agreement supersedes anything the Supreme Court would rule against. Now, any of the tariffs that got collected under the reciprocal tariff agreement, those would be subject to a refund, but anything ongoing would not affect the brand new tariff environment. Okay. As long as there's a trade agreement in place, it supersedes the IEPA decision and off we go into a brand new normal. So even those countries that had a trade agreement in place 2-3 months ago, anything collected under those new trade agreements would not be subject to that Supreme Court ruling. So there's a lot of, yeah, and it's even noisier than what we think. It's even more complex.
Yeah, that is incredibly complex to try to model that all out, but something
Right.
that I know a lot of us are trying to pay attention to. And
Absolutely.
if there is a ruling to change anything, it will be another period of uncertainty while we all try to figure out what that's going to mean, I would suspect.
Absolutely.
Well, Keith, we're over time, but what's time when you're having a great time? So this has been a great conversation. I would like to, I'm sure there's more we could have talked about. I'm sure some people might have some more questions, or if they listen back to this, if you're listening on any of our recorded platforms and you have questions for Keith, what's the best way that people can get in touch with you or reach out with questions?
Sure. You can reach out to me directly at, Keith Prather at armadaci.com. You can also reach me through the website at armada-intel.com. Yeah, and happy to talk to anybody and love the opportunity. So, and thank you, Samantha. This has been fantastic. And next time I'll swing down to your side of the pond and throw coffee.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. And Keith is also on LinkedIn. So if anyone wants to go follow him there. And a special shout out of thanks to our podcast sponsor, Watco Logistics as well. I I was thinking about them throughout this conversation. We're talking about more tariff uncertainty, and a lot of the work that they do stretches across really unique solutions with the bonded warehousing or FTZ space and consolidation in e-commerce. And so they have really been pushing to get creative and work with global supply chains over the last year or two, as all of these curveballs keep getting thrown our way, and they're well positioned to continue to do so. So if you guys have not connected with one of the amazing people at Watco, also Kansas people, so Keith and I and all the Watco team, we're just a lot of great Midwesterners out here that would love talking with you all. So thank you everyone for being here today. Keith, again, thank you so much. I'm so glad it worked out to get you on the show. You're a wealth of information.
Well, I appreciate you. Thanks for everything you do. And so be happy to come back another time.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone who listened in. We appreciate you meeting us for coffee today.
Thanks so much for meeting us for coffee. I'm so excited to be partnered with Watco as our show sponsor. Not only was Watco founded in my home state of Kansas, but the solutions they provide are, in my honest opinion, unmatched. If you have questions about Watco, you can scan this QR code to connect, check out the link in the episode description, or you can shoot me a message on LinkedIn directly, and I'm happy to talk more. If you enjoyed today's show, I'd love if you could leave a rating on your platform of choice. We'll see you next time.